Hi, everyone, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens. In this, our 23rd session of a series that was not supposed to last 23 sessions, we discuss the epilogue, the postscript, and the appendix of American Gods, and consider what this ending tells us about the nature and the shape of Neil Gaiman's story. If you don't have an appendix to your version of American Gods, then you don't have the author's preferred edition, and you're not missing out on much. We may well, in fact, circle back around to a discussion of the author's preferred edition versus the original incarnation of this book at the end of tonight's session. We'll see if we have time to discuss that too. Thank you all for joining me tonight. It is great to have you all here. Before we get started, a little personal word to someone who has joined us here in the YouTube chat frequently of late. Angela Lurie is going through some trying personal circumstances this week, and if you have a few love words to offer her here in the YouTube chat or via Twitter, then I urge you to do so. Angela, you are absolutely the best, and I will be thinking of you on Friday. I hope that everything turns out for the best that it possibly can. We'll be thinking of you. Let's get into our discussion then, although I guess before we get to the many slides that we have to discuss in this session of Storms on the Way, a couple of open questions now that we're here at the end of the book. The first is this: what is the deal with Shadow Moon? Why is Shadow so important? Why is it so necessary for Wednesday to recruit him? Now that we know what he is, who he is, we still don't know why he matters so much. Arguably, if Shadow had been absent from the narrative entirely, then Odin and Loki would have succeeded in their con and would have gained unsurpassed power. Was Shadow really necessary for Wednesday's recruitment efforts? Well, he played a part, I suppose, in the recruitment of Chernobog and in the recruitment of Easter, but now that we know that the war was never real, would it have changed anything if Wednesday hadn't taken him on their little father-son road trip? The answer here may be, as it is so often in American Gods, maybe all about belief. We know that gods can't really meaningfully, functionally believe in each other. They're just not wired for it. They lack whatever special skill that is that allows mortals to sustain the supernatural creatures. So throughout the novel, the emphasis that Wednesday puts on Shadow's belief is odd, because Shadow is a god. So why does it matter so much? Well, it may be that Shadow is a god, but believes himself to be a man. Does that allow him to believe as a mortal would? Or greater still, does the power of a god and the belief of a mortal man somehow allow him to give supercharged belief, supercharged prayer to those gods in whom he, finds his faith? Does that unique combination of heritage and ignorance, I suppose, allow him to believe more fiercely and more absolutely than a mortal can? Is it possible that throughout this book, Shadow's belief in Wednesday is supercharging Odin? Is it possible that this is why Odin is capable of all that he achieves? Well, possibly. It's also possible that tricksters, mythologically speaking, are oftentimes undone by their own plots. We talked last time about Loki's deal with the dwarves that led to him keeping his head but having his mouth sewn shut to prevent such pacts from being made in the future. Is it possible that Wednesday has, through arrogance and short-sightedness, sown the seeds of his own destruction? That would be kind of fitting for a story of this type, particularly a story of this type revolving around characters like these. So I'm not entirely sure what we make of Shadow here at the end of the book, and we will be paying close attention to who Shadow is, to what Shadow is in these last two chapters and on into the postscript, I suppose. Shadow is kind of, in some senses, a more baffling character now than he has ever been, and yet, in another sense, more himself now than he has ever been. Certainly, some of his internal tension seems to have been resolved. It seems to have been laid at rest. We're now not apparently worried about whether or not Shadow is alive. Shadow is now not necessarily worried about whether or not he is alive. We're not worried about his place in the world, because his place in the world has been to some extent explained to our satisfaction, if not to Shadow's. And there is possibly one other question that has a relevance, has a bearing on this discussion as we move through the end of the book. And that is the question of the gold coin. When Shadow kills Laura, when he finally takes Laura's life from her at the end of last week's reading, he causes the gold coin that resurrected her, the gold coin that was given to him accidentally by Mad Sweeney, the gold coin which Mad Sweeney tells Shadow was intended for the King of America. He takes that coin back and causes it to vanish. What does that mean? What does that indicate about Shadow's power, about Shadow's role? Is it simply the coin trick? Did he simply pocket the gold coin and then it is never mentioned again? Well, that seems unlikely. It seems unlikely that such a significant artifact would simply vanish from the narrative as it vanished from the world. It seems as though Shadow is capable of unmaking the coin, but he is also capable of taking it into his possession, of claiming it in a way that presumably he couldn't earlier in the story. So what is the gold coin? Is Shadow the King of America? What does that even mean? These are questions which we will continue to ruminate over as we move through the closing chapters here. Jonathan says Balder is connected to the dawn and the sun himself. Yes, that's absolutely true. So he could perhaps have a right to it, though even then it would only be a right of metaphor, a right of symbolism, as it were, unless, of course, the gold coin were always intended for Shadow, and the line about the King of America is just Mad Sweeney engaging in a bit of, mythic hyperbole. That could also be the case. This might explain, Shadow's true nature might explain why he came into possession of the coin in the first place, and also why this one singular coin was capable of enacting something unprecedented, of bringing Laura Moon back to life. These are open questions, and these may be for you, as they are for many readers of American Gods, frustratingly open questions. It wasn't really until I started tracking the movement of the story as a whole this week that I got to thinking about the ways in which American Gods subverts our expectations and subverts the promise that it makes right at the beginning of the novel. We are led to believe that this is one kind of story. We're led to believe, in fact, that this is a magical realist tale, that this is the story of a mortal caught up in the fairy realm, in the realm of gods and of magic. And those stories never end well for mortals. But Shadow isn't technically a mortal, or isn't completely immortal. His experience is very different, and his own personal story is subsumed by the power of the greater narrative, the power of the narrative of America. More on that right at the end of tonight's session, though I guess that is also where we begin as we move into chapter 19 here with our first slide of the evening. One describes a tale best by telling the tale. You see? The way one describes a story to oneself or to the world is by telling the story. It is a balancing act, and it is a dream. The more accurate the map, the more it resembles the territory. The most accurate map possible would be the territory, and thus would be perfectly accurate and perfectly useless. The tale is the map which is the territory. You must remember this from the notebooks of Mr. Ibis. This is really interesting and engaging perspective on a story that has kind of been around for a long, long while, but was codified in part by George Louis Borges in the book On Exactitude in Science. This is the quote from that book, translated, of course, into English. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the cartographers' guilds struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it. They delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So the idea is that in an empire obsessed with cartography, a map is created which is a one-to-one transliteration of the empire itself, and it is overlaid upon the empire itself. That is, people no longer inhabit the land, they inhabit the map of the land. Or, to borrow Mr. Ibis's one-to-one comparison here, they inhabit the story of the land. Well, doesn't that sound a little bit like America? We're not inhabiting the land itself, certainly within the pages of American Gods, and the sharp distinction drawn between America as a narrative, as a story, as a thing possessive of a sense of itself, and the underlying land, that has endured for ages. The difference between the geography of America and the idea of America, these two things crash into each other. These two things are overlaid the one upon the other, and there is conflict in that overlaying. But of course, also, the map becomes useless. The map, which is synonymous with the thing itself, is not in any way a functional, useful map. It is a shroud. It is representative only in the most literal sense. But as Mr. Ibis tells us, stories are representative in a broader sense. They exist to be told. They are themselves the telling of the thing. They are both noun and verb. A story cannot exist if it remains untold. A book has no meaning, has no purpose if it remains unread. Thus it is in the telling of the story, in the reading of the book, that we give function to these forms, that we give purpose to these underlying artifacts. But when the map has expanded to cover the empire and the meaning of the empire itself, the land itself is lost, then the story has to fill that same space, in a sense. We cannot shroud America with a one-to-one geographical map of this country, but we can tell the story. In fact, we will tell the story. We must tell the story. The story will find dark corners and occupy them. It will spread and it will cover and it will permeate and it will saturate. Over time, there is no land left but that which is occupied by story. This is why Whiskey Jack and the Buffalo Man and the other gods of the land are also in decline in American Gods, because their space, their geographical space, certainly, but more importantly, their mythic narrative space has been taken. It has been occupied. It has been filled by something else. So I want to think about stories. There's a reason I think that this is our little epigram here at the beginning of the epilogue. I want to think about stories as we move forward. I want to think about the stories that we have heard, and I want to think about the stories that we are telling now, particularly the story of Shadow. I also want to talk about, as we move through the epilogue, the title of the epilogue itself. There are 4 parts to American Gods, excluding the little postscript that we get. Part 1 is entitled Shadows. We talked about that back at the time. There are multiple shadow moons and also multiple shadows. There is the storm clouds on the horizon are casting a shadow, and there are shadows of belief and of story, and of course the shadows on the cave wall. There are many possible metaphorical and symbolic interpretations of that title. So part 1 is entitled Shadows. Part 2, My Ainsel. We talked about the meaning of that for shadow, the meaning of Mike Ainsel's surname, my own self in the Scots. Part 3 is The Moment of the Storm, which seems to be a perfectly literal kind of title until Shadow actually gets to the climax, when the storm itself is suspended. It's not the moment of the storm, it is the moment of the storm. It is, I realize that's not perhaps the most transparent piece of rhetoric that I've ever engaged in, but there it is nonetheless. It isn't the being of the storm, it is the fraction of the storm. It is the actual necessary moment. It's not the storm itself that matters, but it is what occurs at the storm or beneath the storm or within the storm. And then here, the epilogue, something that the dead are keeping back. And this, I must admit, puzzles me. I'm not entirely sure what the something is that the dead are keeping back. I'm not entirely sure of the reference here, and this may be my own kind of lack of cultural knowledge here in the United States. This is not my, my native culture. So what I've absorbed imperfectly and osmotically, but still, I'm not sure the meaning of this. What is it that the dead are holding back? I mean, there is one thing, I suppose, if nothing can be described as a thing, but the absence that Shadow embraced when he himself died has now been lost again. He is back in the world again. And it is a world, as we see, waxing into springtime. It is a world that is coming out of the storm, refreshed and renewed. And that's a really interesting thing that we can discuss as we move forward, too. But it is a world that is, in some senses, lessened, but then in other senses, just as full as ever it was. The gods retreated from Rock City. Nothing has actually changed. We get the sense, certainly, that we are now in a world of decline. Mr. Nancy seems to nod toward that. And Chernobog seems to nod toward transformation. But transformation is a part of Chernobog's existence. It's a part of his integral duality, that he himself should be changed. So I'm still not sure what to make of this, or what the world looks like on the next page and the next page and the next page. We'll talk about that as we go. It is a cool and gothy phrase, though, says Aaron, which is pretty Gaiman-like. That's fair. And Mitch says, sometimes Neil just wants to be poetic. Seriously, though, the man is capable of not creating prose with meanings in meanings. Yes, that's absolutely fair. It's possible that this is just something that works in the head of Neil Gaiman. Let's pick up our tale then here in chapter 19 as we move away from Rock City and we take a long road trip to Florida, of all places. The two of them were driving the VW bus down to Florida on I-75. They'd been driving since dawn, or rather, Shadow had driven, and Mr. Nancy had sat up front in the passenger seat and from time to time, and with a pained expression on his face, offered to drive. Shadow always said no. "Are you happy?" asked Mr. Nancy suddenly. He'd been staring at Shadow for several hours. Whenever Shadow glanced over to his right, Mr. Nancy was looking at him with his earth-brown eyes. "Not really," said Shadow, "but I'm not dead yet." "Call no man happy until he is dead. Herodotus." Mr. Nancy raised a white eyebrow and he said, "I'm not dead yet, and mostly because I'm not dead yet, I'm happy as a clam boy." "The Herodotus thing, it doesn't mean that the dead are happy," said Shadow. "It means you just can't judge the shape of someone's life until it's over and done." "I don't even judge then," said Mr. Nancy. "And as for happiness, there's a lot of different kinds of happiness, just as there's a hell of a lot of different kinds of dead. Me, I'll just take what I can get when I can get it." Call no man happy until he is dead. And thank you, Shadow, for clarifying what is an oftentimes misquoted extract of Herodotus there. This is not to suggest that we seek happiness in death. That was not Herodotus's intent. Rather, he was saying simply that we can make no judgment of the life of a man until it is done. We need to be able to look at the entirety of a thing before we can see the shape of the thing. And hey, here we are at the end of a novel, trying to figure out what American Gods is about, but we don't yet have the shape of the thing. We don't yet have the ending. This story is not dead, and so we cannot yet judge its happiness. Angela Lurie calls out in the YouTube chat, "Can't judge a story until it's dead." Yes, absolutely right. Absolutely right. We were just talking about this in the critical reading class that I held last night, so this is entirely apposite. Good. Odin tells Shadow, Angela also says previously, Odin tells Shadow that things are waiting for Shadow back in America. Yeah, I want to let's put a pin in our discussion of that scene until we get to it, because I do think that it is removed from the body of the text with great purpose. The appendix, as Gaiman will tell us in the author's preferred edition, was simply a scene which was supposed to occupy, its spot in the middle of the book, and was cut because it didn't really work. And you guys, I'm kind of with Gaiman on this. It doesn't really work. I don't think that it adds anything to the narrative, and I think that it should have been stricken entirely. I'm glad to have it. I think that more books should carry deleted scenes and DVD extras. I really like that idea, particularly authors' preferred editions or revised editions of novels. But the Jesus scene does not, for me, really work. The Odin scene, however, works beautifully, and I like that it is offset from the body of the prose here, that it is offset from the body of the story. It is truly epilogic, and I will make the argument now and then make it again later that the epilogue of American Gods, part 4 here, is not actually an epilogue to American Gods. It is, in many ways, the heart of Shadow's story. The war between the gods, the old gods and the new, is over now, or has at least been indefinitely deferred. But Shadow is still changing. Shadow is still I mean, literally moving. He is still being transformed. Yeah. Good, good. Gildarts Winter says, I dedicate these deaths to Astara. Yes, well, we'll possibly consider that a little later, too. We'll have the opportunity to look back on the dedication of deaths and the dedication of belief. It is a powerful moment in the TV show when we reframe some of this, yes, and suggests immediately that the TV show is going to take a very different track. It is tough to see a version of season 2 of the American Gods TV adaptation that really bears any resemblance at all to American Gods, the book. We have deviated a long way from the heart of this narrative now. And while I'm sure we're going to get some functional proper nouns, while I'm sure we're going to get a version of Sam, and we're going to get a version of Lakeside and a version of Hinzelman, I don't think we're going to get the same kind of story, and I'm all in for that. And that is, by the way, very true to Gaiman's approach to adaptation. He generally does not freely adapt his work into other media without fundamentally changing, the core of the story. That, I think, is going to be interesting to watch. Yeah. Okay, let's push on to our next slide here. This is after Nancy and Shadow have gone singing karaoke, which is an utterly charming scene. Mr. Nancy showed him to the couch. It was much smaller than Shadow, who decided to sleep on the floor, but by the time he had finished deciding to sleep on the floor, he was already fast asleep, half sitting, half lying on the tiny sofa. At first, he did not dream. There was just the comforting darkness. And then he saw a fire burning in the darkness, and he walked toward it. "You did well," whispered the Buffalo Man without moving his lips. "I don't know what I did," said Shadow. "You made peace," said the Buffalo Man. "You took our words and made them your own. They never understood that they were here, and the people who worshipped them were here, because it suits us that they are here. But we can change our minds, and perhaps we will." "Are you a god?" asked Shadow. The buffalo-headed man shook his head. Shadow thought for a moment that the creature was amused. "I am the land," he said. And if there was more to that dream, then Shadow did not remember it. He heard something sizzling. His head was aching, and there was a pounding behind his eyes. Mr. Nancy was already cooking breakfast. A pile of pancakes, sizzling bacon, perfect eggs, and coffee. He looked in the peak of health. Aaron says in the YouTube chat, "They may change Sam a little, but if they ruin Sam, I shall have words." Yes. We do love our Sams here, it's fair to say. So here we have Shadow's last dream of the Buffalo Man, I suppose, or perhaps not. Last dream, penultimate vision of the Buffalo Man might be a fairer way to put it. We'll return to the Buffalo Man in just a few pages' time, but here we get the clearest perspective on the Buffalo Man that we've had in the entire book. He is the land. He is not a god. He was not created for men. He was created of the earth itself. And this is, by this point in our discussion, simply a confirmation. We've kind of figured this out. We've kind of anticipated this already. Thank you very much. And it is fair, I think, to question, well, okay, but what is the real difference? What is the difference between a god of America and the land of America? And the answer to me seems to be authenticity. That Odin is the American version of himself. Wednesday is the American version of himself. That is, he was created by an immigrant culture that already had their own aggregate mythology. So they came into a land and carried it with them, and they overlaid that land like the map. They understood the world around them on a one-to-one, point-by-point comparative basis by telling the stories that did not fit this land. This is why the old gods and the new are different, because they are not products of a genuine engagement with the world around us. They're a product of an engagement with ourselves, with our own existing culture. But that is not true of Whiskey Jack and the Thunderbirds, and certainly the buffalo-headed god, the buffalo-headed man here. They are different. They emerged from the rock of this place. They emerged from the dirt of this place. They were here before there was a concept of here. They existed within the frame of this land before this land was properly framed by our understanding of geography, our understanding of the limits of the universe around us. before we knew that, oh, there are other places, and they're basically kind of like this place. This was the place. I am the land, he said. And I'm interested in Gaiman's choice here, not to give initial caps to the land. I am the land. He is America. He is the oldest god, and he is the native god of this place. And that is not simply an obligation. That is not simply an observation. That is not to say that he is the native land, the native god of this place is not to say that he is the god of peoples who are native and indigenous to this place. He was here before those peoples were peoples. He was here when they were finding their place and finding their own definition in this land. And that seems to be vital. And of course, we've talked constantly throughout this entire series about the difference between America as a geographical region and America, the United States, as an idea, as an ideal, as a story, as a metaphor, as an ambition, as an aspiration, as a tool, as a weapon. We've drawn that comparison constantly, and here is, for me, the definitive perspective on the gap, on the difference, on the shift between those two. That gods which arise natively are of the land, and gods which accompany immigrant cultures are necessarily not. I mean, they are still technically gods of the land, but not this land. The gods of America are necessarily different from the gods of Norway or the gods of India or the gods of New Zealand. It is a different place. The demands that it puts on our mythic framework, the demands that it puts on our understanding of the world are fundamentally different, geographically, climactically, philosophically different. So the buffalo-headed god and Whiskey Jack and the Thunderbirds, these gods have been superseded. They have been overlaid by the map. They have been overlaid by the story, by the meta story, by the endless swirling, dizzying array, by the storm of stories which has swept across America from coast to coast, from, I guess, both coasts simultaneously, crashing into each other here in the Midwest, that as each immigrant culture, as each wave of immigration has swept across America, they have brought with them their own tales, and they have left no space for the existing tales. And of course, I'm here in Oklahoma City, so I have some thoughts on the Trail of Tears, and I have some thoughts on the displacement of culture, and I have some thoughts on what that did to the sense of the land itself. This is not to suggest, by the way, that all immigration is invasive. And it is not even to suggest that the supplanting of an older story with a new is always a bad thing. I think that stories are constantly evolving and changing, and the wars of religion and I guess, okay, let's drain the urgency out of that a little bit. But the conflicts of philosophy and the conflicts of politics, the conflicts of society are simply the quest for a better story. They are defined by the quest for a better story. You come up with a better story and you can change the world. But these stories never had the opportunity to fight, despite the fact that they are, in some sense, more true. Not to say that native stories, this is not to exoticize or to revere the stories of this specific native culture or any assemblage of native cultures. This is not to say, and of course, Native Americans were just so much closer to the earth, so their stories are more true than ours, that we are a fallen people and they have great wisdom. That is not necessarily to say that that is the case. They didn't have the opportunity to fight because they were still in their native land. Theirs was not a story of conquest. It was not a story of travel and transformation. It was simply the story. It was the baseline. These other stories have been weaponized. These other stories have been put to use in a way that the native stories never were, which is why, as I say, they too are in decline. Becca says, my philosopher side is coming out. I'm not going to apologize for that. Hashtag sorry, not sorry, Becca. I know you weren't really teasing me. It's fine. Let's push on then and wrap up this very short chapter, this very short breath here in Florida. Though, of course, if you're in Florida, you know that taking a breath is actually one of the hardest things that you can do, particularly at this time of year. let's move on to the very end of this chapter. Shadow stared at the old trunk some more, willing himself to remember. If I don't go to see Chernobog, he said, what would happen? You'll see him, said Mr. Nancy flatly. Maybe he'll find you, or maybe he'll bring you to him, but one way or another, you'll see him. Shadow nodded. Something started to fall into place. Hey, he said, is there a god with an elephant's head? Ganesh? He's a Hindu god. He removes obstacles and makes journeys easier. Good cook, too. Shadow looked up. It's in the trunk, he said. I knew it was important, but I didn't know why. I thought maybe it meant the trunk of the tree, but he wasn't talking about that at all, was he? Mr. Nancy frowned. You lost me. It's in the trunk, said Shadow. He knew it was true. He did not know why it should be true, not quite, but of that he was completely certain. He got to his feet. I gotta go, he said. I'm sorry. Mr. Nancy raised an eyebrow. Why the hurry? Because, said Shadow, the ice is melting. And this is one of the reasons that Leslie Skipa says here, like the weather in OKC is any better. People in glass houses, Alistair, let me tell you, Skipa, the weather here in Oklahoma City has been perfect today. It was like maybe 80 degrees, maybe like high 70s. It rained this morning. This is a gift here on the 1st of August. I'm very, very grateful for it. Yeah. I got to wear a coat when I went outside today. It was pretty good, let me tell you. So this, I think, is one of the reasons that we've gone to Florida, despite besides the fact, I suppose, that Florida is the place associated with Mr. Nancy, that this is where he came to America, from the Caribbean, from the trade of slave ships. This is where he alighted in this land. This is, the Southeast is the home of Anansi, and within the bounds of America, let me stress that, the Southeast is the home of Anansi. This is where he can be found. So it's absolutely fitting that he and Shadow should go there. And then they should spend their time in the heat and the humidity and the riot of life. Good Lord, the descriptions that we get of insect life and animal life throughout this very brief chapter are dizzying. This is a place that is suffused with life. But somewhere it is still cold. And somewhere the ice is melting. And now the final pieces of what may seem to be a minor mystery are falling into place. And Shadow is going to return to Lakeside. Before we get to Lakeside, I want to talk a little now about the structure of the end of this novel, because I've recently had calls in a number of different places to talk about the rise of four-act structure, four-act narrative structure. Traditionally, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, we told stories in 3 acts. We have an act of initiation, an act of progression, and then an act of resolution. In the first act, we are given our inciting incident, the conflict begins, it escalates, and then when the nature of the conflict is truly revealed, we transition into the second act, where the protagonist and the antagonist vie against each other. The second act turns on a midpoint, a beat right at the heart of the story that somehow changes our understanding of the conflict, somehow changes the world. It moves the world beneath our feet to add dramatic interest, but also to kind of tighten the noose around the protagonist's neck. Then when we understand the nature of the climax, when we know what it is that we have to do, we transition into the third act, which is the act of resolution. This is where you will find our final showdown and then our resolution, our denouement, our return to narrative justice here in the world. That 3-act structure has existed for, no kidding, the better part of 3,000 years. It has been around forever, and it is used in every possible medium, in every possible culture, in every possible way. It is the de facto narrative form across the face of the earth. But in the course of the last 15 years, I suppose, 20 years maybe, I've noted the rise of 4-act structure because we're getting more ambitious in our narratives. We are, as a culture, becoming more literate. We expect more from our stories. We look for more from our stories. And one of the ways that we can deliver more is to separate out our climax, to, in fact, have 2 completely separate climaxes. This is true of Pixar movies and Star Wars movies. This is true of Marvel movies. My God, Marvel movies are metronomic in this regard. You can easily, trivially demarcate the 4 acts of any of the MCU movies, superhero movies in general, blockbuster movies in general. Oftentimes, any kind of high-octane adventure story will have this 4-act structure. And the 4-act structure is, in its first movements, identical to 3-act structure. It has the same first act. It has the same second act. But it has 2 versions of the 3rd act. The first version of the 3rd act, Act 3, addresses the external conflict. It addresses the thing which has driven the protagonist to this point. In the case of American Gods, it addresses the war of the gods. That is the purpose, that is the function of the 3rd act here. Then the 4th act refers to the internal conflict. Something has changed about the protagonist and peace must be achieved. Peace must be sought here. So we resolve the external conflict, then we resolve the internal conflict. We find peace for our protagonist, or we flip that sometimes. That's a little more unusual, but we sometimes flip that and we resolve the internal conflict and then the external conflict, right? We see this just everywhere now. And Gaiman has given us a 4-act structure. This is why part 4 of the story is not actually an epilogue. An epilogue is an event or a sequence of events which take place after the story is done. And the story extends up to the point where the conflict ends. That's the simple definition. Our story begins with our inciting incident. It begins when the core narrative conflict, the goal of the protagonist, crosses the goal of the antagonist, and there is tension there. That is what starts our story, and our story ends when that is no longer true, when one person has won and one person has lost, and we can go on about our lives. Some goal has been achieved and the other has faltered. But that's not true yet. And it's not a case of Lakeside being a loose end here. It's not just because we haven't finished the mystery of Hinzelmann and the Clunker. It's not just because Lakeside is a good place. It is because Shadow has not yet found peace. Shadow has not yet found Shadow. And arguably, that has been as large a part of his experience here. This is what the 2nd act of this story is all about. The second part of the book, all about Shadow struggling with his own identity, struggling with Shadow versus Mike, effectively. He hasn't resolved that yet. He's learned something about himself, but he still doesn't know who he is. So we have to go back to Lakeside, because that is where this conflict took place. We're not just tidying up loose ends here. We're still in the thick of the narrative. So that will carry us into our last chapter. Skipa says, refraining from making a joke about sex and separate climaxes. Well, we're only doing a 2-climax story, so it's a simple night. All right. Good. Okay, Angela says, it's resolving around the conflict. Yes, I love that Shadow hasn't found Shadow. So good. That's excellent. Excellent. All right. I'm glad. Disney movies, says Becca. Oftentimes, modern Disney movies, yes. Traditional Disney movies didn't so much actually do that, because traditionally, Disney movies didn't have any kind of internal conflict. You know what? Cinderella is Cinderella, and she stays Cinderella to the end of the book. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of Cinderella is that she is 100% Cinderella at all times. The same is true of Snow White. The same is true of Sleeping Beauty. I suppose it wasn't until the early 90s that we started resolving internal and external conflicts within the span of Disney movies. I'm thinking of Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin. Certainly The Little Mermaid is a definitive kind of internal, external 4-act structure. That works really quite nicely. Yeah. Okay. So with that said, let's move into the final chapter of the book and get to Thin Ice. There was a chain across the short driveway that led down to the lake, and a warning sign forbidding entrance to people or to vehicles. Thin ice, it said. Beneath it was a hand-painted sequence of pictograms with lines through them. No cars, no pedestrians, no snowmobiles. Danger. Shadow ignored the warnings and scrambled down the bank. It was slippery. The snow had already melted, turning the earth to mud under his feet, and the brown grass barely offered traction. He skidded and slid down to the lake and walked carefully out onto a short wooden jetty, and from there he stepped down onto the ice. The layer of water on the ice, made up of melted ice and melted snow, was deeper than it had looked from above, and the ice beneath the water was slicker and more slippery than any skating rink, so that Shadow was forced to fight to keep his footing. He splashed through the water as it covered his boots to the laces and seeped inside. Ice, water. It numbed where it touched. He felt strangely distant as he trudged across the frozen lake, as if he were watching himself on a movie screen. A movie in which he was the hero, a detective, perhaps. There was a feeling of inevitability now, as if everything that was going to happen would play itself out, and there was nothing he could have done to change a moment of it. He walked toward the clunker, painfully aware the ice was too rotten for this, and that the water beneath the ice was as cold as water could be without freezing. He felt very exposed out on the ice alone. He kept walking, and he slipped and slid. Several times he fell. He passed empty beer bottles and cans left to litter the ice, and he passed circular holes cut into the ice for fishing, holes that had not frozen again, each hole filled with black water. The clunker seemed further away than it had looked from the road. He heard a loud crack from the south of the lake, like a stick breaking, followed by the sound of something huge thrumming, as if a bass string the size of a lake was vibrating. Massively, the ice creaked and groaned, like an old door protesting being opened. Shadow kept walking, as steadily as he could. "This is suicide," whispered a sane voice in the back of his mind. "Can't you just let it go?" "No," he said aloud. "I have to know." And he kept right on walking. Let's think a little here about Gaiman's mastery of his prose. It is ungainly. It is conspicuous how often we use the word ice. We never use a synonym for ice. We just repeat the word ice over and over and over again. The layer of water on the ice, made up of melted ice and melted snow, was deeper than it had looked from above, and the ice beneath the water was slicker and more slippery than any skating rink, so that Shadow was forced to fight to keep his footing. We've got a full display here of Gaiman's skill as a storyteller, Gaiman's power as a wordsmith here. It is stunning. And again, just ice, ice, ice. He walked toward the clunker, painfully aware the ice was too rotten for this. The water beneath the ice was as cold as water could be without freezing. He felt very exposed out on the ice alone. We continue. The next paragraph. He passed empty beer bottles and cans left to litter the ice, and he passed circular holes cut into the ice for fishing, holes that had not frozen again, each hole filled with black water. The ice here is everywhere. The ice here is everything. The ice is what is giving this place its form, its shape. The lake will continue, but the lake in the absence of the ice will be completely different. We're getting some Frozen references here in the YouTube chat. That's very satisfying. And I love that description. The clunker seemed further away than it had looked from the road. He heard a loud crack from the south of the lake, like a stick breaking, followed by the sound of something huge thrumming, as if a bass string the size of a lake, was vibrating. A kind of failure of the metaphor there, a bass string the size of a lake. Well, okay, if you like. But that's purposeful. That's deliberate, because we're not allowed a distraction. We're not allowed to move away from Shadow's precarious position out here on the ice, out here on the surface of the lake. He can't think of another metaphor for this. A bass string the size of a park, the size of a football field. No, it is the lake. It is all the lake. It is perfect. Why is Shadow here? Why does he return to Lakeside? Why does he have to know? Why does he picture himself here as the protagonist in a movie in which he felt he was the hero, a detective, perhaps? There was a feeling of inevitability now, as if everything that was going to happen would play itself out, and there was nothing he could have done to change a moment of it. Why is he now feeling this fatalist self-perspective? Why is he now feeling as though he is embedded in a story? Well, in part because he is, but what else? I guess in order to answer who is Shadow now, we may have to answer what is Shadow now. Shadow has just faced down all the gods of America. He has just changed the path of history. He has prevented a war that would have had untold consequences. He has taken the life of his dead wife. But something else happened. A life was dedicated to him. A death was dedicated to him. Remember when Laura drives the stick that becomes the spear through herself and into Loki, killing him? She dedicates that death to Shadow. That is, as we know explicitly from Odin and Loki's fundamental plan, an act of enormous significance, an act of enormous power. But it's not an empty act. It's not a simple transaction. It's not a fungible act. It is not, oh, hey, here is this, dollar bill. It's something much more powerful than that. That's why we needed a war. That's why we needed conflict, because that is where Odin lives. That is where he is found. We dedicate these bloody deaths to Odin, and that empowers him. So a death was dedicated to Shadow. Shadow has now been believed in. Shadow is now more than he was before. But the gods aren't just fueled by belief. They're defined by belief. Odin is what he is because those are the stories that are told about Odin. Loki is what he is, and Chernobog is what he is, and the Zarias and Mad Sweeney and all of the gods that we've met are what they are because of the stories told about them. They don't get to change. Chernobog doesn't decide to just, suddenly be a happy-go-lucky guy who lives in, Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and smokes a lot of weed and hangs out. He's not that guy. That's not who he is. His story defines him. And now Shadow has a story. The only person for sure that we know told a story about Shadow is Laura. She dedicated this death to him. That had enormous power, enormous significance, because of course she didn't just dedicate the death of Mr. World to him, the death of Loki Lysmith to him, but she dedicated her own suffering and torment to him. She stabbed herself in Shadow's name. What is the story that Laura was telling about Shadow? And to what degree does that story now bind Shadow? To what degree is he now the figure that Laura believed him to be? Does this have any weight at all, or is this different entirely? Skipa says, so wait, Laura is already dead. So is it Loki's death that empowers Shadow? And if so, that's a god's death, so that's even stronger. I mean, yeah, I think that Shadow may have been empowered at that moment. Okay, let's look at it this way. Would Shadow have been successful in his desire to make peace between these warring factions of gods if not for the death that was dedicated to him? If that's not the case, if Shadow would have been unsuccessful without that death being dedicated to him, what is the nature of the death itself? Shadow doesn't enter that conflict stronger and more powerful as Odin would with a death dedicated to him. Shadow enters it more humbly, more humanly, more peacefully. So what is the story that Laura tells of Shadow? My answer to this is actually pretty apparent in the text, I think. We know the story that Laura tells about Shadow because she tells it over and over again. Puppy. That's the story that Laura tells. That's the name that she gives him. Gods are defined by their names. This is why Odin has 50 of the damn things. This is why all the gods have powerful names, names that are definitive, names that mean something. And so does Shadow. But it's not Shadow Moon. It's certainly not Balder. That's not a name that he has any personal connection to at all. It's Puppy. And if Laura dedicated the death of Loki Lysmith, the death of the trickster god, at something approaching the height of his power on the eve of destruction, because we must remember, the war was necessary for Odin because Odin is powered by death and by conflict and by bloodshed. Loki is not powered by death. Loki is powered by chaos, and they have already brought the world to the brink. Loki is, in the moment of his death, I'm damn sure more powerful than he has ever been. And the sacrifice that Laura makes, both of herself and of Loki, I can think of no more powerful act of sacrifice possible. And she does it in Shadow's name. So what does she turn Shadow into? Why is Shadow here in Lakeside? It would be one thing for Shadow to suddenly figure this out. He remembers the message from Ganesh and he thinks, no, these people who trusted Mike Ainsel, who were friends with Mike Ainsel, I must go and save them. I must go and solve this mystery. I must go and do good. That would have been a perfectly appropriate personal connection for Shadow. But this is evidently more than that. He doesn't know why he's doing it, but he's doing it nonetheless. And he feels this sense of fatalism. This is dangerous. Why is he doing it this way? Why isn't he going to, I don't know, to pick someone at random, Chad? Why isn't he going to Chad Mulligan and saying, look, I know this is crazy, but you need to check this out? The police officer of Lakeside would be absolutely obligated to do so and would presumably have access to a fire truck or something that can get the clunker off the ice and do this safely. But it's not Chad's job. It's Shadow's job, because he's the puppy. He's the guy who's going to save those who need to be saved. What do you guys make of that? Aaron says, the great god puppy, powerful indeed. God of puppies, says Gildorts Winters. I think that's maybe a little different. I'm not quite sure that I'm there, but yes. Good. Let me see here. Gildarts Winter says she did love him. She never really showed it, though. And Becca says, I think she loved him to the degree she was capable. By the end, she was willing to die for him. So maybe willing to die for him, not willing to live for him. Laura knows at that point that Shadow can resurrect her. You know, we get this whole thing of the Eagle Stone throughout the entire book. Now, Laura may not know the fine details, but hey, it's Shadow and he's standing right in front of her. He could do it. Presumably, there are any number of gods that could do it. So why not? Because she's ready to die. Because actually loving Shadow isn't enough at that point. But it is obviously significant to her. Yeah. Yeah, good. As long as we've known Shadow, says Skipa, he's been trying to stay unnoticed. Is that part of his puppy persona? Yeah. I mean, okay. I'm attaching the word puppy to Laura's perception of Shadow. And she is critical of that throughout the book. You know, we get these ideas that he's not really alive, that he's not really present, that he goes unnoticed. And that's maybe fair. But a more positive read of that might be humility. Shadow doesn't need to rule. Shadow doesn't need to be in charge. Shadow doesn't need to be worshipped. He can just be. So this is my speculation here. I'm curious here whether or not Shadow has been defined in part by the story that Laura told about him, certainly believed about him. We still have a lot of ground to cover, you guys. A lot of ice to cover. Let's push onward. The trunk was open. The trunk, excuse me, was open an inch. He reached down and opened it the rest of the way, pulling it up. The smell was bad, but it could have been much worse. The bottom of the trunk was filled with an inch or so of the half-melted ice. There was a girl in the trunk. She wore a scarlet snowsuit, now stained, and her mousy hair was long and her mouth was closed, so Shadow could not see the blue rubber band braces, but he knew they were there. The cold had preserved her, kept her as fresh as if she'd been in a freezer. Her eyes were wide open, and she looked as if she'd been crying when she died, and the tears that had frozen on her cheeks had still not melted. Her gloves were bright green. You were here all the time, said Shadow to Alison McGovern's corpse. Every single person who drove over that bridge saw you. Everyone who drove through the town saw you. The ice fishermen walked past you every day and nobody knew. And then he realized how foolish that was. Somebody knew. Somebody had put her here. He reached into the trunk to see if he could pull her out. He had found her after all. Now he had to get her out. He put his weight on the car as he leaned in. Perhaps that was what did it. This is when the facade of Lakeside, which has already got some cracks in it for us, begins to collapse entirely. This is not even the first time that a young person has been sacrificed here on the lake. We'll get to that later, of course, but right now, the idea of Alison McGovern being here, first off, I suppose, let's look at the detail here. Again, Gaiman controls the pace of the novel masterfully. He slows us down. The cold had preserved her, kept her as fresh as if she had been in a freezer. Her eyes were wide open, and she looked as if she had been crying when she died. And the tears that had frozen on her cheeks had still not melted. Her gloves were bright green. Here we have again that extended, slower prose. We're dragging out these details and then punctuating them with much shorter details. The note of the scarlet snowsuit, I have to say, there was something so personal about the scarlet snowsuit, so juvenile, so innocent about the scarlet snowsuit that just, breaks my heart. It's very, very tough to read. Becca says, before there were car trunks, were there steamer trunks? Well, we get some suggestion of the wreckage at the bottom of the lake. So yes, before there were cars, other things had been thrown in the lake every winter. That does seem apparent. And I oftentimes wonder, as I read this part of the book, how this works in other languages. American Gods has been translated into basically every language that there is, but the whole appearance of Ganesh works because English is stupid. And because we have the word trunk meaning an elephant's trunk, and the word trunk meaning the trunk of a tree, and the word trunk meaning the boot of a car. I mean, I guess that doesn't even work particularly well if you're a British English speaker reading this book. But how the hell does that work in other languages? Those words cannot work the same way in every other language on the face of the earth. I'm just curious about such things. So somebody knew, somebody had put her there. He reached into the trunk to see if he could pull her out. He had found her after all. Now he had to get her out. It isn't enough to know the truth. This is what Shadow said earlier. He just needs to know. Well, now he knows. He's right. She was in the trunk the whole time. And yes, everyone who drove over the bridge, everyone who drove through town, the ice fisherman who walked past you. Hey, Shadow, we're all well aware that that is including you, that you did those things too, that you are in part speaking to your own sense of guilt here, an unearned sense of guilt, but a sense of guilt nonetheless. So he has to get her out. He is still being driven by something more than his stated aim. Hey, I don't know why I'm going back to Lakeside. I don't know why I'm doing this thing. I don't know why I feel like a protagonist in a movie as I'm walking across here. I just need to know. Well, actually, now I do know, and that's not enough. I need to get her out. He has to save her, even when she can't be saved. Let's push on, because the ice at this point shatters. Oh, actually, did I lose a slide? I guess, did I? Oh, wait. No, I'm good. I didn't lose a slide. I did shuffle some of these. I had even more slides, believe it or not, before we sat down. So, okay. Shadow falls into the water. He has this vision of all the other children who have been lost over the course of the years beneath the waves here of the lake, beneath the ice of the lake. He is suffering. He cannot find air. He cannot get back to the surface. And then he breathed deep gasps of air, stretching flat on the creaking ice, and even that would not hold for long, he knew, but it was no good. His thoughts were coming with difficulty, treacle slow. Just leave me, he tried to say. I'll be fine. His words were a slur, and everything was drawing to a halt. He just needed to rest for a moment. That was all. Just rest. And then he would get up and move on, for obviously he could not just lie there forever. There was a jerk. Water splashed his face. His head was lifted up. Shadow felt himself being hauled across the ice, sliding on his back across the slick surface, and he wanted to protest, to explain that he just needed a little rest, maybe a little sleep. Was that asking for so much? And he would be just fine if they just left him alone. He did not believe that he had fallen asleep, but he was standing on a vast plain. There was a man there with the head and the shoulders of a buffalo, and a woman with the head of an enormous condor, and there was Whiskey Jack standing between them, looking at him sadly, shaking his head. Whiskey Jack turned and walked slowly away from Shadow. The buffalo man walked away beside him. The Thunderbird woman also walked, and then she ducked and kicked, and she was gliding out into the skies. Shadow felt a sense of loss. He wanted to call to them, to plead with them to come back, not to give up on him, but everything was becoming formless and devoid of shape. They were gone, and the plains were fading, and everything became void. So what happens here with the glimpses of the gods of the land? What is Shadow experiencing here? How do we parse Whiskey Jack's action? Looking at him sadly, shaking his head. Whiskey Jack turned and walked slowly away from Shadow. Then the Buffalo Man walks away too. Then the Thunderbird walks away too. They leave him. But why? How do we interpret shaking his head? That's really the Whiskey Jack standing between them, looking at him sadly, shaking his head. Our interpretation of this entire scene is dependent on that beat. Skipa asks an interesting question. See, this I don't get. She says, are the gods of the land annoyed with him for solving this issue? That's possible, but I'm really not sure that that's the case. Though we must remember that there are native gods. And let's not forget either, Whiskey Jack is a friend to Shadow, but Whiskey Jack is also basically Native American Loki. He is not, generally speaking, a good dude. He is more mischievous and less chaotic than the Norse Loki, for example. But wow, yeah. My possible interpretation of this is a little different because we have to remember what is happening here. Shadow has this moment to rest. He has this moment to this belief. Of course, we know from our privileged perspective that actually what will happen is that Shadow will lay down and go to sleep and die on the ice. That is what happens to people who get cold. But here he is already in the midst of being rescued. He's being dragged across the ice. He's being dragged across the ice by Hinzelman. Whiskey Jack and the buffalo-headed god and the Thunderbird, it seems to me, can't get to Shadow. They can't help him. They can't rescue him as Whiskey Jack has before. This is different. And it's different because Lakeside is the ultimate example of what happens when the map overlays the land. Of what happens when the story permeates so deep, saturates so deep that there is no original story of the land left. They can't get to him. The place. It's a good town. It is so constrained and fueled and defined by a narrative that has nothing to do with the geography, that has nothing to do with the land whatsoever, that they just can't reach him. Lakeside, as Jonathan Nash says, is Hinzelman's territory. Becca says, this is Hinzelman's place. He has the power here. He does have the power here, but he is not solely responsible for this because he is not the only one who tells the story of Lakeside. Everybody tells the story of Lakeside. Chad and Mabel and Marguerite Olsen and even Sam tell the story of Lakeside with every other breath. It's a good place. It's a good town. It's not like other places. It's not a part of the land. Lakeside is special. This is why Wednesday sent Shadow here in the first place, because it was inaccessible. And now we must ask, inaccessible from whom? Who was Wednesday trying to protect Shadow from? Because it now makes no sense for him to be trying to hide Shadow from the new gods, because the new gods were super in on it. They were all working for Mr. World, and their loyalty to Mr. World seems absolute in a way that Wednesday could only have envied, I'm sure. Mr. World isn't interested in capturing Shadow, isn't interested in tracking Shadow. They're interested in the war, and Shadow appears to be, for some inexplicable reason, necessary for that war. So from whom was Wednesday protecting Shadow? Well, the obvious answer seems to be Whiskey Jack. It seems to be the gods of the land, the buffalo-headed god. It is possible, given how Shadow's visions have apparently intermittently been transparent to Wednesday through the course of the book, it is entirely possible that Wednesday knows that Shadow is dreaming of the buffalo god. And he knows what that means. That may be the reason that Shadow is hidden away in Lakeside. It's not about the new gods. It's not about the old. It may well be about his loyalty to Wednesday and instilling a certain urgent paranoia in Shadow, maybe even keeping him away from Laura, although God knows that doesn't seem to be terribly effective. But it does seem as though Lakeside is immune to the presence or the influence of the gods of the land themselves. These gods who are the only creatures not to have any stake in the war between the new gods and the old. Yeah. Let me see. What if Wednesday was trying to protect Shadow from him, says Gildarts Winters. I might need a gloss of that. I might be interested in your thoughts there, Gildarts. That's fascinating thought. Yeah. Skipa says, do the people in Lakeside actually know what is going on, or does Hinzelman's power work as a cloak over their minds? I would say not. Judging by Chad's response in a couple of pages' time, I would say not. Chad is more of Lakeside than anyone but Hinzelman. I think it's fair to say, you know, maybe Mabel. I don't know. Mabel's pretty great. But certainly Chad is very representative of Lakeside, and he clearly has no idea. And if anyone might even suspect it would be the chief of police. So my read of this is no, nobody knows. And Hinzelman is just a community leader. He's just, you know, a father among this community. Yeah. Good. And Hinzelman also has a mastery of the story, remember. You know, he tells the story of what happened to everyone. He tells the story of what happened to each of the kids who was lost in the lake. Okay, Gildarts, I will message you after this is all done. You can tell me what you think. Yeah, good. Excellent. Jonathan says, mostly because knowledge is distinctly a type of power in the community of gods. This is picking up from his thought. I doubt anyone besides Hinzelman actually knows how he keeps power here, just that he has managed to keep power in a very specific place. Excellent. Yeah. And he's defining that in a way that is accessible to others. It's a good town, which we'll see here on this next slide, in fact, as we talk with Hinzelman. You know what I don't understand, said Shadow. He hesitated, putting his thoughts in order. I don't understand why you saved my life. Well, said Hinzelman, the way I was brought up, if you see another fellow in trouble. No, said Shadow. That's not what I mean. I mean, you killed all those kids. Every winter. I was the only one to have figured it out. You must have seen me open the trunk. Why didn't you just let me drown? Hinzelman tipped his head on one side. He scratched his nose, thoughtfully rocked back and forth as if he were thinking. Well, he said, it's a good question. I guess it's because I owed a certain party a debt, and I'm good for my debts. Wednesday. That's the fellow. There was a reason he hid me in Lakeside, wasn't there? There was a reason nobody should have been able to find me here. Hinzelman said nothing. He unhooked a heavy black poker from its place on the wall, and he prodded at the fire with it, sending up a cloud of orange sparks and smoke. This is my home, he said petulantly. It's a good town. It's a good town. As Kate says in the YouTube chat, it's a good town / it's a magical place. Yes. Drawing the connection once more from American Gods to Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., two texts which superficially don't have a great deal in common, but hey, you never know how these things work out. It's a good town. Hinzelman is once again confirming that A, he had a previous relationship with Wednesday. Well, we pretty much knew that anyway. That was abundantly clear by this point in the text. But B, that this is his home. It's a good town. It is defined by its goodness. And in part, that goodness is defined from a certain isolation. Lakeside just isn't like anywhere else. Let's take a look then at, gosh, yeah, we still have a distance to go here before we rest. So let's keep pushing on and take a look at the price that Hinzelman exacts. And you made the lake. Hinzelman peered at him, surprised. Made the lake? They were calling it a lake when I got here, but it weren't nothing more than a spring and a mill pond and a creek. He paused. I figured that this country is hell on my kind of folk. It eats us. I don't want to be eaten. So I made a deal. I gave them a lake and I gave them prosperity, and all it cost them was one child every winter. Good kids, said Hinzelman, shaking his old head slowly. They were all good kids. I'd only pick ones I liked. Except for Charlie Nelligan. He was a bad seed, that one. He was, what, 1924, 1925? Yeah, that was the deal. The people of the town, said Shadow. Mabel, Marguerite, Chad Mulligan, do they know? Hinzelman said nothing. He pulled the poker from the fire. The first 6 inches at the tip glowed a dull orange. Shadow knew that the handle of the poker must be too hot to hold, but it did not seem to bother Hinzelman, and he prodded the fire again. He put the poker back into the fire, tip first, and left it there. Then he said, They know they live in a good place. While every other town and city in this county, heck, in this part of the state is crumbling into nothing. They know that. And that's your doing. This town, said Hinzelman. I care for it. Nothing happens here that I don't want to happen. You understand that? Nobody comes here that I don't want to come here. That was why your father sent you here. He didn't want you out there in the world attracting attention. That's all. Elizabeth asks an excellently pointed question here in the YouTube chat. It seems to me that Hinzelman kidnapping and killing these kids shouldn't count as a sacrifice if no one remembers this bargain. Is it a sacrifice if you don't know you're offering it? I guess the counterpoint question there, the companion question to that question is this. Does a prayer still count as a prayer if you don't know that you're praying? Everyone in this town loves this town. Everyone in this town walks around this town talking about it being a good town. Is that a form of prayer? Are they empowering Hinzelman just as surely as he is being empowered by the taking of a child every winter. And even then, is he being empowered by the taking of a child every winter? Is this actually the pact, or is he just fulfilling his own story? The story that is told of the Kobold Hinzelmann back in the Black Forest is that he takes a child every winter. So Hinzelmann takes a child every winter because he is as his story demands. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. For all that we're getting answers here about Lakeside, we're not getting all of the answers, but we are getting perhaps the most important answer, which is that this is a town that is more story than place. This is the ultimate example of what happens in a place like America, in a land that, land is the wrong word to use in this context, in a place that is defined more by its idea than its geography, more by its identity than its landscape. Lakeside is the ultimate example of that. It is nothing more than an idea, but that idea has power. Yeah. And then, of course, justice is done. "He came down here, Chad," said Hinzelmann. "He threatened me." "No," said Chad Mulligan. "He didn't. I've been here for the last 10 minutes, Hinzelmann. I heard everything you said about my old man, about the lake." He walked further into the den. He did not raise the gun. "I mean, Jesus, Hinzelmann, you can't drive through this town without seeing that goddamn lake. It's at the center of everything. So what the hell am I supposed to do?" "You got to arrest him. He said he was going to kill me," said Hinzelmann, a scared old man in a dusty den. "Chad, I'm pleased you're here." "No," said Chad Mulligan, "you're not." Hinzelmann sighed. He bent down as if resigned, and he pulled the poker out of the fire. The tip of it was burning bright orange. "Put that down, Hinzelmann. Just put it down slowly. Keep your hands in the air where I can see them, and turn and face the wall." There was an expression of pure fear on the old man's face, and Shadow would have felt sorry for him. But he remembered the frozen tears on the cheeks of Allison McGovern and could not feel anything. Hinzelmann did not move. He did not put down the poker. He did not turn to the wall. Shadow was about to reach for Hinzelmann to try and take the poker away from him when the old man threw the burning poker at Chad Mulligan. Hinzelmann threw it awkwardly, lobbing it across the room as if for form's sake, and as he threw it, he was already hurrying for the door. The poker glanced off Chad's left arm. The noise of the shot in the close quarters of the old man's room was deafening. One shot to the head, and that was all. So Hinzelmann comes to an end, and it is appropriate that he comes to an end at the hands of Chad Mulligan, who, as previously described, is the lakesidiest lakesider who ever lakesided. He is proto-Hinzelmann. He is more he embodies more fully the story of Lakeside than any other individual that we have met besides Hinzelmann himself. And Hinzelmann knows that it's a lie. Therefore, Chad's belief is the most powerful. Chad's belief is the strongest. Elizabeth says, "I was so sure Chad Mulligan was going to end up the baddie. Very glad to be wrong. Maybe not mind that it was Hinzelmann." Yes, you guys, we, well, if you'll forgive the pun, dodged a bullet there. I am so glad that Chad is as he appeared to be. And Kate says, "I'm so glad that Shadow removed Chad's memory of this. Chad didn't deserve to have to live with this horror." I think you're absolutely right, Kate, and I would split that into two separate horrors. You know, firstly, the horror of what he has done. He shot someone. That doesn't happen all the time in Lakeside. But much more importantly, he doesn't have to live with the breaking of his myth. He doesn't have to live with the breaking of his truth. He can still believe in Lakeside. He can still tell people who come in. He can pick up strangers at the side of the road and take them to Mabel's for pancakes and watch them sip their coffee and their hot chocolate and say, "Hey, you know the thing about this place? It's a good town." He still has his faith. And it's not for nothing that Shadow's final act of kindness for Chad is to not even preserve, I guess, but to restore, to actively restore that faith. Shadow is a good man. Shadow is a good man. Let's talk about Audrey. Now that we have dealt with Hinzelmann, now that we have dealt with Lakeside, we're moving through the end of this plot, and we really are just picking up some loose ends now. Now we're just we're neatening everything up. Well, Elizabeth says here, "But he'll witness the demise of Lakeside, and there's no stopping that. It's a shame." Here's the thing about that. I'm not sure that that's true. It is true that Hinzelmann will no longer be protecting Lakeside, But the power of the story is in the story. This is where we started tonight. This is what Mr. Ibis told us. The only way to describe a story is to tell the story. The noun is the verb, that these two things are the same. And the story of Lakeside is now astonishingly powerful. Everyone in town already believes it. I'm not at all sure that Lakeside is going to decline. I'm not sure that Lakeside is going to change. It's not going to have this canker at its heart anymore. It's not going to have this underlying darkness anymore. And maybe Hinzelman was actually protecting it. Hinzelman was certainly controlling who came to town, but now Chad can do that. The town can police itself. The community can police itself. I'm not sure that removing the god invalidates the story. I think Lakeside's going to be just fine. I think Lakeside's maybe even going to be better than ever. You know why? Because it's a good town. Let's take a look at the story of Audrey. Of course, I'm an optimist, so I would say all of that about Lakeside. What happened to Audrey? Asked Shadow. Day after they took you away, she said she liked me as a friend, but it would never work out between us being family and all, and she went back to Eagle Point. Broke my gosh darn heart. Makes sense, said Shadow. And it wasn't personal. Hinzelman didn't need her here anymore. They drove back past Hinzelman's house. A thick plume of white smoke was coming up from the chimney. She only came to town because he wanted her here. She was something to help him to get me out of town. I was bringing attention he didn't need. I thought she liked me. They pulled up beside Shadow's rental car. What are you going to do now? Asked Shadow. I don't know, said Mulligan. His normally harassed face was starting to look more alive than it had at any point since Hinzelman's Dan. It also looked more trouble. I figure I got a couple choices. Either I'll... He made a gun of his first two fingers and put the fingertips into his open mouth and removed them. Put a bullet through my brain. Or I'll wait another couple days until the ice is mostly gone, tie a concrete block to my leg, jump off the bridge, or pills? Sheesh. Maybe I should just drive a while out to one of the forests. Take pills out there. I don't want to make one of my guys have to do the cleanup. Leave it for the county, huh? He sighed and shook his head. You didn't kill Hinzelman, Chad. He died a long time ago, a long way from here. So again, the threat of Lakeside, but even as Chad, despairing, is considering suicide, even as he thinks that there is no way back from this, what is he thinking of? What is he looking toward? Well, it's Lakeside. It's the story that has given his life shape. It is the faith that guides him. Maybe I should just drive out a while into one of the forests, take pills out there. I don't want to make one of my guys have to do the cleanup. Leave it for the county, eh? Plus, then his death doesn't further sully Lakeside. Yeah. So, Shadow removes his memory. Shadow leaves Lakeside peaceful, and I'm going to continue to believe for the rest of my days happy. It's going to be just fine, you guys. It's going to be just fine. And then we cut ahead to Sam. Natalie looked at Sam. Then she looked again. Then she said, where did you get those from? What? The flowers, the ones you're holding, Sam. Where did they come from? Did you have them did you have them when we left the coffee house? I would have seen them. Sam looked down. Then she grinned. You are so sweet. I should have said something when you gave them to me, shouldn't I? She said. They're lovely. Thank you so much. But wouldn't red have been more appropriate? They were roses, their stems wrapped in paper, 6 of them, and white. I didn't give them to you, said Natalie, her lips firming. And neither of them said another word until they reached the movie theater. When she got home that night, Sam put the roses in an improvised vase. Later, she cast them in bronze, and she kept to herself the tale of how she got them, although she told Caroline, who came after Natalie, the story of the ghost roses one night when they were both very drunk. And Caroline agreed with Sam that it was a really, really strange and spooky story, and deep down did not actually believe a word of it. So that was all right. Shadow slipping back like a shadow into Sam's life to give her roses is very, very sweet indeed. I love the account that we get of Shadow's POV, and I love, of course, that we get Sam's account and then Shadow's account. This is just a human gesture. Now we really are in the last couple of pages of the novel, and we really are wrapping it up. But even now, these tiny little beats. Sam put the roses in an improvised vase. Later, she cast them in bronze, and she kept to herself the tale of how she got them, though she told Caroline, who came after Natalie, what a great little beat that is. She told Caroline, who came after Natalie, the story of the ghost roses one night when they were both very drunk, and Caroline agreed with Sam that it was a really, really strange and spooky story, and deep down did not actually believe a word of it. So that was all right. She did not actually believe a word of it. So the story gets to be Sam's. Caroline isn't sharing it. She's not taking it. She's not making it her own. She doesn't believe it. She lets it go again. So it stays Sam's. And of course, shadows. Such a good beat, you guys. Such a good beat. Okay, we've got 2 more slides to do here, and then 2 more for the postscript and 1 for the appendix, and then I have some closing thoughts. Good Lord, guys, we've still got a lot of material to get through. Let's talk about Chernobog. He sipped the hot coffee, as black and as sweet as he remembered. He heard a deep male voice in the corridor, and he sat up straighter. He was pleased to see his hand was not trembling. The door opened. Shadow? Hi, said Shadow. He stayed sitting down. Chernobog walked into the room. He was carrying a folded copy of the Chicago Sun-Times, which he put down on the coffee table. He stared at Shadow. Then he put his hand out tentatively. The 2 men shook hands. I came, said Shadow. Our deal. You came through with your part of it. This is my part. Chernobog nodded. His brow creased. The sunlight glinted on his gray hair and mustache, making them appear almost golden. He frowned. Is not, he broke off. Maybe you should go. It's not a good time. Take as long as you need, said Shadow. I'm ready. Chernobog sighed. You are a very stupid boy, you know that? I guess. You are a stupid boy, and on the mountaintop, you did a very good thing. I did what I had to do. Perhaps. We're going to get reminded of Belobog. We're going to get reminded of Chernobog's dualistic counterpart in Slavic tradition in just a moment, but we're already getting hints that this is the case. The sunlight glinted on his gray hair and mustache. Remember that conversation that we had? When I was young, I was dark and he was light, and now I am gray and he probably is gray too. We've already drawn that comparison. We're already drawing the comparison with Belobog, making them appear almost golden. Well, he's swinging into that side of things. The new light, the sunlight is doing this. The coming spring is doing this. He is changing. And that's perfect. And now we'll get to everyone's favorite line in the entire book. Shadow closed his eyes and raised his hand, and he waited. The head of the sledgehammer was cold, icy, cold, and it touched his forehead as gently as a kiss. Book! There, said Chernobog. Is done. There was a smile on his face that Shadow had never seen before, an easy, comfortable smile like sunshine on a summer's day. The old man walked over to the case and he put the hammer away and closed the bag and pushed it back under the sideboard. Chernobog? Asked Shadow. Then, are you Chernobog? Yes, for today, said the old man. By tomorrow it will all be Belobog, but today is still Chernobog. Then why? Why didn't you kill me when you could? The old man took out an unfiltered cigarette from a pack in his pocket. He took a large box of matches from the mantelpiece and lit the cigarette with a match. He seemed deep in thought. Because, said the old man after some time, it is blood, but it is also gratitude, and it has been a long, long winter. Puck! The touch of the sledgehammer against Shadow's head. Chernobog's humanity, Chernobog's gratitude for the coming of the spring, for his own transition back into his lighter self. This is what Shadow has done. He has accomplished far more than simply ending the war between the old gods and the new. He has brought a new kind of peace. The storm has passed, but the storm has brought, as storms always do, life and change and vitality. The world is refreshed and rejuvenated now, partly because of the storm, yes, but also because the storm passed. This is the legacy that Shadow has left. He has made good on his promise. Hey, what kind of god is Shadow the god? Well, he's a god who keeps his promises. Isn't that right, puppy? He's a good man. And here he faces his final fate with utter serenity. This is the way it has to be. This is the truth of it. He is confident now in a way that he has never been before. Contrast this. I urge you to contrast this with the first scenes with Chernobog, where Shadow is fractured and nervous and inconstant. Now it has changed. Shadow has serenity. Shadow has peace. Shadow knows who he is, and he's willing to fulfill that. Jonathan says, it seems it was suggested that Beelzebub hadn't been seen in a long time, and by renewing that transition, it makes Chernobog whole again. Yes, I think that Chernobog has been restored to his, well, by tomorrow, all will be Beelzebub. I mean, we're getting a sense that he is actually going to change, but he has perhaps been restored not to sun, not to light, but to his own dualistic cycle again. He was never supposed to be nothing but Chernobog, but he was constrained. He was locked into this role, and that is what he was. But now he gets to be all that he is again. And we might question why it is that the world feels this way. What has changed? What has been altered by Shadow? And I'm not sure that I completely understand it. Except that the storm passed. Except that we have this sense of a new beginning. And this is a sense of a new beginning that we know is felt by mortals like Sam and felt by gods like Chernobog and the Zarias. The world is different now because of Shadow. And I like to think that in part, that's because there is a freeing up of belief. We get these beats all the way through the story, and they're generally given to the new gods rather than the old, but certainly it is implicit in all the actions that Wednesday takes, now that we understand his plot, that belief is a kind of zero-sum game, that there is this much faith in the world, and if it's going to someone else, it's not going to you, which is why Odin and Loki want to corner the market here. But it's possible that a lot of that belief has just been freed up, that the gods no longer believe. The war was never what it was supposed to be. That the new gods have dissipated. Have they returned? Is there still a media in this world? Is Technical Boy going to arise again? It's possible, but it seems to me as though these anchor points, these selfish, self-serving anchor points, have been removed. And now there's just more belief. There's just more energy free in the world. And that is attaching to things that people actually want. We're not bound by the old stories so much anymore. Now we can invest in and be reflected in new stories. Shadow is a god who was a willing sacrifice, says Angela. Powerful renewal and restoration. Yeah. Becca says he was a willing sacrifice and he was spared. Grace? Yeah, the exact mechanic there is interesting, because it is clearly the debt, the promise, the obligation, the understanding that takes Shadow all the way back to Chicago. And we had that beat in the prior chapter where he says to Nancy, what happens with Chernobog? Do I go to him? And Nancy says, it doesn't matter. You go to him, he'll go to you. It doesn't matter. It's going to be. This is what it is. So Shadow seems to be fulfilling that. And he's peaceful now because he has his identity. But ultimately, Chernobog isn't done. But crucially, he has been changed because of Shadow's actions. This isn't as appropriate as it would have been for American Gods. We don't get a Deus Ex Machina resolution. We get something that is entirely dependent upon Shadow's character and his strength, not just the events that have happened to him, but fundamentally who he is. Let's keep moving forward here. We've got a couple quick slides to cover here in the postscript. So long after the events, well, okay, we don't actually know how long after the events. Sometime after the events of American Gods, Shadow finds himself in Iceland. He finds himself in Reykjavik, where he meets a familiar figure. The old man nodded slowly. He said, my people went from here to America a long time ago. They went there and then they returned to Iceland. They said it was a good place for men, but a bad place for gods. And without their gods, they felt too alone. His English was fluent, but the pauses and the beats of the sentence were strange. Shadow looked at him. Close up, the man seemed older than Shadow had imagined possible. His skin was lined with tiny wrinkles and cracks like the cracks in granite. The old man said, I do know you, boy. You do. You and I, we have walked the same path. I also hung on the tree for 9 days, a sacrifice of myself to myself. I am the Lord of Eos. I am the god of the gallows. You are Odin, said Shadow. The man nodded thoughtfully as if weighing up the name. They call me many things, but yes, I am Odin, Bor's son, he said. I saw you die, said Shadow. I stood vigil for your body. You tried to destroy so much for power. You would have sacrificed so much for yourself. You did that. I did not do that. Wednesday did. He was you. He was me, yes. But I am not him. A little housekeeping here as we address the idea that has been plaguing us throughout the duration of the novel. Well, Odin is Odin, Wednesday is Odin, but is he all the Odins, or is he the uniquely American Odin? And now we know. Now we know that when the gods leave their homelands and are taken to the new world, they don't travel with them. They are recreated in this image. It's crucial. It's vital. And it's perfect, of course. I do know you, boy, says Odin here. And of course he does, because he recognizes Balder. He recognizes his son, who in gentler versions of the Norse myth would have lived a long life alongside his father, until, of course, as I mentioned when we introduced Balder, being killed by mistletoe to herald Ragnarok. But hey, that's a story for another time. And Ragnarok presumably has not happened yet in Iceland. Yes. Yes, he is me, but I am not him, quotes Angela in the YouTube chat. Isn't that beautiful? And then, having made his peace, in a sense, with his father, we get the end of the book. Again, said the Lord of Asgard with an imperious motion of his head, his voice deep and commanding. More. Do again. You people, said Shadow, you're never satisfied. Okay. This is one I learned from a guy who's dead now. He reached into nowhere and took a gold coin from the air. It was a normal sort of gold coin. It couldn't bring back the dead or heal the sick, but it was a gold coin, sure enough. And that's all there is, he said, displaying it between finger and thumb. That's all she wrote. He tossed the coin into the air with a flick of his thumb. It spun golden at the top of its arc in the sunlight, and it glittered and glinted and hung there in the midsummer sky as if it was never going to come down. Maybe it never would. Shadow didn't wait to see. He walked away, and he kept on walking. And that is the end of American Gods, calling back to the most convincing coin trick that Shadow ever learned. I'm interested here in the idea that it was a normal sort of gold coin. It couldn't bring back the dead or heal the sick, but it was a gold coin, sure enough. We leave here unanswered. This is Gaiman at his finest, because we absolutely evoke the symbolism of the gold coin, but we don't answer the question. What happened to the coin for the King of America? What happened after Shadow plucked it from Laura like, I don't know, some kind of ripe berry? If you've been watching the TV show, that will make more sense. But here, ultimately, perfectly, Shadow manages to demonstrate a coin trick for the Allfather, for his father, for the being who, in a sense, created him. I mean, by proxy and at one remove, by proxy and at a couple of removes, I suppose, technically speaking, but still, it's there. Shadow practices his coin trick. He tells the story, and in the end, the story doesn't matter. Remember how before he could never master the story side of the trick? He could never spin the tale that would enchant the audience. He could perform the trick, but not make it work, not connect it with people. Well, now it doesn't matter. The story doesn't matter. He tossed the coin into the air with a flick of his thumb. It spun golden at the top of its arc in the sunlight, and it glittered and glinted and hung there in the midsummer sky as if it was never going to come down. Maybe it never would. Shadow didn't wait to see. He walked away and kept on walking. Because in the end, the story only has power over you as long as you care about it. And if you choose to walk away, the story will be what it is. But it doesn't touch Shadow anymore. Let's wrap up then. I do have some brief thoughts in conclusion, but we do have one more slide to look at, because in the appendix to the author's preferred edition of American Gods, we get this scene between Shadow and Jesus. I had to pull this because I think it's beautifully written. I do not like this scene. I do not like this scene as a part of the book. Cutting it was absolutely the right choice. But again, Jesus is conspicuous in his absence through the novel of American Gods. He should be the most powerful god in modern America, you know, in some kind of aggregate sense. This is a very different take on Jesus than the take that we get in the TV show. I'm not convinced that I like this one less than I like the TV show, but I'm glad that it isn't in the body of the book. The man led Shadow into a vast office. There was no desk in there, though. "Have you thought about what it means to be a god?" asked the man. He had a beard and a baseball cap. "It means you give up your mortal existence to become a meme, something that lives forever in people's minds, like the tune of a nursery rhyme. It means that everyone gets to recreate you in their own minds. You barely have your own identity anymore. Instead, you're 1,000 aspects of what people need you to be, and everyone wants something different from you. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is stable." Shadow sat in a comfortable leather chair by the window. The man sat on the enormous sofa. "Great place you've got here," said Shadow. "Thanks. Be honest now. How's the wine?" Shadow hesitated. "Kind of sour, I'm afraid." "Sorry, that's the trouble with wine. Okay, wine I can do easily, but good wine, let alone great wine, well, you've got weather, soil acidity, rainfall, even which side of the hill the grapes are grown on. Don't get me started on vintages." "It's fine, really," said Shadow, and he swallowed the rest of the wine in one long gulp. He could feel it burning in his empty stomach and the bubbles of drunkenness rising at the back of his head. "And then this whole deal of new gods, old gods," said his friend. "You ask me, I welcome new gods. Bring them on. The god of the guns, the god of bombs, the gods of ignorance and intolerance, of self-righteousness, idiocy, and blame, all the stuff they try and land me with. Take a lot of that weight off my shoulders." He sighed. "But you're so successful," said Shadow. "Look at this place." He gestured, indicating the paintings on the walls, the hardwood floor, the fountain in the courtyard below them. His friend nodded. "It had a cost," he said. "Like I said, you have to be all things to all people. Pretty soon you're spread so thin you're hardly there at all. It's not good." We can talk about this aspect of Jesus. We can talk about the degree to which being a god is oddly dehumanizing. There's an interesting perspective to be had there, particularly for a figure like Jesus, who was presumably within this frame a mortal man who was transformed, at least is in his own origin story. This Jesus, of course, isn't, because Jesus, like all other gods, was brought to America. He is no more native here than he is anywhere else, though more widespread, more popular, certainly, it's possible. I really wanted to call this out. His friend, that's a really specific and odd addition, says Jonathan. It is. I like it quite a lot, though, because it does suggest, I think he is his friend from Shadow's perspective. That Shadow is, I mean, arguably just at ease here, that he is in the company of a companion. And we must remember that this is when Shadow is hanging on Yggdrasil. So this is not really happening. This was supposed to be part of his dream sequence. But nonetheless, I like that Shadow has this connection with Jesus. I like that Shadow has a flicker of faith there that is his own, that is, or at least was his own. It's really quite beautiful. And that is American Gods. We're not done with Storms on the Way, but we are done with the novel. And I wanted to take a moment here just before we wrap up to reflect a little on the book as a whole. In the pages of American Gods, Neil Gaiman has accomplished any number of remarkable things. We discussed all the way back at the beginning of the seminar that it was his intent to create an aggregate mythology for America, for this vision of America, for the United States, for this idea more than this place. And then to tell a story in that space. Okay, this is the mythology. What happens next? And of course, because he's telling a myth, because he's creating a mythology, you need the apocalypse. You need Ragnarok. You need the end of all things. That is how you know what a story is. Just as Mr. Ibis suggests, the story exists in the telling, and this is the story that is being told about America, but stories are given shape by their endings. So the aggregate mythology is given its shape. All aggregate mythologies are given shape by their apocalypse myths. And American Gods is no different. But of course, this is America, so the apocalypse isn't even what it seems to be. It's not about principle, it's about power. So according to that criterion, I suppose, Gaiman's work is an obvious success. The conflict between the old gods and the new gods, the greater, more subtle conflict between immigrant gods and the land itself, these things are beautifully realized. And they're often surprising. They're often richly nuanced. They're often detailed in ways which, honestly, they need not be. And in the hands of another author, a lesser skilled author, would not be. And against that backdrop, with the frame of this story, Gaiman has created some fantastically memorable and resonant characters. I won't ever forget Shadow Moon, or Laura, or Wednesday, or Chernobog, or the Zarias, or any number of characters in this book. Mr. Nancy, we definitely shouldn't forget Mr. Nancy, or Mad Sweeney, come to that. But the greatest success of American Gods, I would argue, is America. The road trip aspect of this novel is engaging because we like hearing about these places that are real. We like hearing about Rock City and Lookout Mountain. We like hearing about the House on the Rock, and we're all super charmed at the thought of Neil and Amanda taking a weekend getaway and going on the carousel on the house in the House on the Rock. But the road trip aspect is unnecessary. It doesn't change the shape of the story that some of these events, a handful of these events, are happening in real places and a handful are happening in unreal places. Because if America didn't exist, then Gaiman would have just created it. If this wasn't a novel set in an ostensibly real place, then American Gods would have one of the most compelling and engaging fantasy worlds of all time. If this wasn't true, well, it would still be true. And in part, Gaiman accomplishes this by distilling out of America the stories which define it and telling them with a greater than usual sense of skill, of clarity, of urgency, of depth. But for all of his skill as a writer, Gaiman is given one hell of a head start. And he's given that head start by America itself, which has literally since its founding, since its earliest days, been engaged in exactly this kind of autobiographical determinism. We tell the story of America in order to turn America into what it is. And the America that we describe, the America that is defined by our stories, that has been defined by all of our stories for all of these years, is a storytelling machine itself. America tells its own story. So for all of Gaiman's successes, it seems to me that his greatest success is creating another story of America, another story that perpetuates itself. And of course, that ability to tell a story of America that defines it, that shapes it, that moves it forward has perhaps never been more important or necessary or inspiring. Let's take the positive spin on this, inspiring than it is right now. In American Gods, Neil Gaiman tells a story of America which isn't simplistic or reductive or shallow or juvenile or uncomplicated or plainly satirical. He tells a story of America which is, at its end, both true and compelling and quintessentially American. Gaiman has done, as I described all the way back in our very first session together here in Storms on the Way, Gaiman has done what few American authors have done. He has captured the spirit of America on the page, and that is a thing to be applauded. I find American Gods to be a challenging novel in some ways. I find the author's preferred edition specifically to be a challenging novel in some ways, and it isn't perfect. The pace is kind of all over the place. The focus, particularly in the author's preferred edition, is kind of all over the place. We make presumptions that should perhaps be addressed in the text, and the text emphasizes points with a sledgehammer certainty that could perhaps be left a little more ambiguous for the reader's comfort. But none of that matters, because this is as much America as the land that it seeks to represent, as the story that it seeks to tell. It is a fictional book, a fictional story that is more true than true, and in the end, that is the only thing that we can ask of our fiction. I have loved studying American Gods with all of you. I've loved talking about the TV show, and of course, this is not the end of Storms on the Way. Let me call up the slide here to show you our final session for now. We will return again. Yeah, good. We will return later this week, gosh, Friday, August the 4th, 2017, 9 p.m. Eastern, we're looking at the short stories. We're looking at Monarch of the Glen, which you can find in the volume Fragile Things, Short Fictions and Wonders, published in 2006. The link to both of these books will be in the show notes, and I urge you both to pick them up. I urge you to pick both of them up, I should say. Definitely pick up Fragile Things, though, because it also contains Neil Gaiman's Sherlock Holmes meets H.P. Lovecraft story, A Study in Emerald, which I adore. I love that story. So you get both that and Monarch of the Glen in Fragile Things, Short Fictions and Wonders, published in 2016. And then the novel, or the collection, the anthology, Trigger Warning, Short Fictions and Disturbances, published in 2015. That contains the short story Black Dog. These are both very short. We're going to blaze through these in no time at all. It's probably going to be a shorter session on Friday, but I hope that you will be able to join me here. Jonathan says, I love The Study in Emerald. So good, right? Isn't it amazing? I can't talk about that on Friday, but I think maybe a Point North one-shot at some point about A Study in Emerald specifically. I want to kind of do I want to do more work on Lovecraft. I'm actually a huge fan of Lovecraft, as problematic a figure as he is, and as problematic some of the elements of his fiction are. I would love to do more Lovecraft. So it's possible that I'll have the opportunity at some point in the future to talk a little about the Cthulhu mythos, talk a little about that kind of cosmic horror. And of course, A Study in Emerald is just fantastic. Gaiman's a master. That's all it is. We will, of course, be thinking of you, Angela. We will, of course, raise a glass to you on Friday, and we'll be hoping to hear very positive things from you very soon thereafter. That, though, is going to do it for this penultimate session of Storms on the Way. Guys, thank you all so much for listening. It has been an absolute pleasure. I hope that you have enjoyed American Gods as much as I have. I hope that you will enjoy the short stories as much as I do. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care.